Well, maybe.
Probably after.
All right. Yeah. I'm sure.
Yeah, it's hot on it, so.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So I was by myself and I thought, he's gonna do like something pretty Saturday.
Airline.
Airline day. No, not fair. So anyways, all right, yeah.
Well, I think-
Good morning. Is that bad enough? Okay. Yes. All right. Shall we get rolling? I have no slides for you. I'm so sorry. I had a wedding this weekend and went away and got back into town into the like fullness of, you know how it is, you sort of pay the price. But it was worth it. I had an amazing time and I learned a lot and it was really productive and good, so it was worth it. I'm good for another 30,000 miles. So this morning it'll be mostly talking, teaching. We do have a handout and that will be helpful to you. Some sort of theological background and points of reference as we've been talking. So, of course, during the Renaissance, the humanists are rediscovering these classical Greek and Roman texts of scripture, as well as the patristics and all kinds of good things. And so ad fontes, am I saying it right? Ad fontes, which is Latin for to the sources. And so there's this desire to, if we can just get back to the early church, to the original scripture, we can just get back to if we can find Christianity in its purest form, you know, then we'll be able to get everything figured out. But alas, you know, unfortunately, there's multiple scrolls, there's multiplicity in the early church. So there isn't one perfect set of scriptures. I said that to my Bible professor one time. I was like, wouldn't it be cool if they could just find the one that was just the one? And she was like, you would just take the fun out of living. And I was like, oh, I'm looking at this all wrong. Okay. Anyway, just so the reference, so that's going to come in a lot of different flavors. So from the sort of Catholic Reformation side, that's going to look like in addition to scripture, right? And Erasmus's translation into the Greek or from the Greek, that piece of it is that will lead into a kind of sola scriptura with a big emphasis on scripture among the evangelicals. But among the Catholic reformers, it's also just going to stretch into the sort of traditions of the church as well, and what were people thinking and doing in those first 3 centuries. The other big question that's looking long for everyone is, of course, you know, how are we saved, or what is justification? That's sort of the underlying question that everybody's sort of wrestling with, and people have kind of gone back and dialed back into Augustine. So salvation for Augustine is God's healing humans to relocate their desire to be toward God. So grace is a therapy that moves the will towards God. So salvation is an action of God, by God, but received by the human being. And so in the theological frame, there's this dynamic relationship between God's salvific acts and the human response and reception to those acts. And Augustine has attributed it, he said, God created us without us, but he will not save us without us. I've said that in sermons before. So that's kind of one way of understanding salvation. And then of course there's Luther, justification by faith alone, drawing on Romans in particular. It is a gift that one accepts through faith. And our nature can only receive, but can't really cooperate, there's less of a dynamic between how we are saved. Anyway, so, so that's a little just remembering the theological issues that are in the water at the moment. So the emergence of the English Reformation, looks a little different than the Reformation on the continent, I say. So Henry VII, right, upends Richard's rule, and that initiates the Tudor dynasty, the Tudor monarchs who come into power. Henry VII has a firstborn child, Arthur, Prince of Wales, and he is going to be the next king. He's in line for the throne. If you look at some of the dates, you'll see you've got Catherine of Aragon is born in 1485 and Arthur 1486, so she's just a year older than him. And this betrothal is arranged when Catherine's very young. Her parents are Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And this is a politically advantageous, good move, right, to get these youngsters together and unite these kingdoms. Arthur's little brother Henry's born in 1491. And then they do marry. This all becomes important later. So they do, Arthur and Catherine get married when she is 16 and he is 15 years old. But just a year later, Arthur dies of tuberculosis. And so her father, Henry VII, is fearful of the loss of the dowry and this alliance with Spain. And so she is betrothed to his younger son, Prince Henry, later Henry VIII. Everybody with me so far? Okay. In order for this betrothal to take place, the Pope, Julius II, issues a formal papal dispensation permitting the marriage between Catherine and Henry to allay fears around the legality of marrying one's brother's widow. There are countervening texts in the Hebrew scriptures about this. There's a prohibition, but then there's also, you gotta do it, so it's confusing. There's not one voice, but anyway. So, so when Henry VII dies, Henry VIII accedes to the throne and becomes king. They are married, Catherine and Henry. Catherine at the time is 24 years old, Henry is 18. And then they are the coronation, their joint coronation where they're crowned king and queen together. Everybody with me so far? Okay, you all know this story, but don't kind of, they're not these two minutes. Well, it's like, anyway, it happens really fast and there's a lot of moving parts. Many of them I had to just not tell you about, but I need the dates to kind of try to help me keep it in some kind of order. Anyway, and then, and Catherine will have a total of 6 pregnancies, 4 miscarriages. She will give birth to a son in 1511. That child will die at 2 months old. And then, later in 1518, Princess Mary is born. Catherine was 33 years old at the time. So Catherine was a strong lady for her time. Other things of note is that, just so you can get a sense of where in the dynamic things are happening. Erasmus makes a trip to England, in 1499, and so he visits at the universities, and so that humanist influence is, in the water in that turn of the century, time frame. And then a little bit later, Erasmus's Greek New Testament is published, and this just sort of like sets off fireworks of thought. Anyway, so during Henry's early reign, So 1509 to 1523-ish. Henry is a traditionalist, and Catholic, there's Catholic stability in his early reign. Henry is devout, he is learned, he is committed to the faith, and he views himself as a pious Christian who has a role in being a pious Christian leader. The other thing that's interesting is that England is a little different from the continent in its experience of the church. So there are abuses in the church, of course, but less so. You may remember the Canterbury Tales and like the stories where they're making fun, but apparently they just had a better sense of humor about it. I don't know. Of course, they're removed from Rome by some distance, so the squabbles and different kinds of little skirmishing wars and things that are happening in Europe are not, England has their own wars, but there's some distance there. The clergy are generally better educated, still not great, but better than in other places. We see that the cult of the saints is very popular in England, along with local pilgrimages to Canterbury and other shrines. And in the time leading up to the Reformation, we see an increase in the number of clergy being ordained. We see investment in the renovation of churches and the building of cathedrals. These are all signs of a healthy church in the realm, right? And a fairly traditional church in the realm. In 1521, Cardinal Wolsey will burn Luther's work, and Henry writes, or at least it's under his name, in defense of the sacraments. So it's published as Henry's own work. It may not have been Henry's own work, it may have been Cardinal Wolsey. Pope Leo rewards him with the title Fidelis Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. And this is a publication of a fairly orthodox work. And you will see the influence of this thought kind of reigning in evangelical swing over the years ahead. So scene's a little different, circumstances are a little different. So you've got Henry, defender of the faith, Pope really likes him, he's in line with everything else. They're not real big on this Lutheranism thing, not quite yet. Meanwhile, however, these evangelicalism and new ideas are really growing in the university settings, but it's along a continuum, right? We've got Erasmus with this sort of humanist Catholic reform movement within the church, and then you have more radical departures concerning the Eucharist and the Bible and the saints and all of that, right? So kind of what Anthony was talking about last week. And we for that. So another thing that's sort of happening, but it's happening more at the learned letter for people who read, which not that many people do, right? So this is happening at we might say among the elites, this evangelical spark. The other thing that happens is Tinsdale's English translation of the New Testament is published in Europe because it is not allowed to be published in England, right? So you're getting a sense of sort of start in one place. What's interesting about this translation is that it is a translation from the Greek, the Erasmus Greek, and not the Vulgate. And you can, the way it's translated, they reinforce evangelical ideas. So the word agape, right, in Greek, versus charity in the Latin. So agape connotes sort of love as an indisposition. Charity in the Latin caritas denotes more of a love of work or a love in action, a kind of doing kind of love, right? So you see the faith works thing already there in the translation. Ecclesia, which is translated church in the Vulgate, is translated assembly or gathering or congregation through the Greek. So there's this, this is what's happening in the Bible with Bible stuff. But despite all that, most of the common people are happy with their traditional religion and going to church and doing their thing. Uh, but, um, but Henry is keen to assert the traditional rights of a Christian king. He feels like the Pope has been encroaching and he's pushing back, and he doesn't necessarily want to break with the Pope, not initially. And this all kind of comes to a head around what becomes known as the King's Matter. So Catherine of Aragon does not bear a male heir. And back to the marriage to Arthur. Henry believes, and it seems like in good faith, he like really believes this, and didn't just make this up. That the reason she hasn't been able to have a male son is that, this is God's punishment for him marrying Arthur's widow. That should not have been allowed, that dispensation was wrong, but who gave him the dispensation? Oh, no. So, despite Julius' papal dispensation, complicating matter, he meets Anne Boleyn in 1525. And apparently they hit it off. So he seeks an annulment from Catherine. He gets all the religious scholars of the day to write an argument to the Pope about why they think this is in fact, true, and there's all their stamps are kind of on this document. To say that, an annulment basically says that a marriage doesn't really exist, right? And so that would mean that Mary is almost like a legitimate child at that point. So, it's problematic. And Julius passes on, Clement becomes Pope, and Clement is connected to Charles V and the Holy Roman. Anyway, he does not want to make the wrong people mad, namely Spain. And so he's not granting this. He's not reversing the Pope and saying, oh, he made a mistake. And so he formally rejects the request. And this, understand how many years this is over the course of several years, there have been, delegations and diplomacy and all kinds of smart people going back and forth between England and Rome and trying to get this worked out, and then in the end, it doesn't get worked out. And Henry feels betrayed, and he seeks alternatives. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn is sympathetic to evangelical views, and as a result of his relationship with her and at court, this evangelical circle has formed around Henry, and he of course has been influenced by their thoughts. So if Rome won't reform the abuses of the church, then why won't this godly king reform the abuses that are present in the church of England? And so Henry starts to live into this royal supremacy idea, right? Which is that the Christian king has a special authority in the governance of the church. Thomas Cranmer, who you know from our prayer book, is made Archbishop of Canterbury, and annulment is granted. Anne and Henry are married, and Anne is crowned queen in June 1st, 1533. And 5 months later, Elizabeth is born. And then the Act of Supremacy, which is constructed by Cranmer and Cromwell, is passed by Parliament in 1534. And it asserts that Henry is the supreme head of the Church of England on earth and has the power to govern the church temporally, right? So there's a kind of distinction between, the church not on earth, the spiritual church, and the church on earth. That it is his role to protect the church from heresy and abuse. The bishops retain a good deal of authority around doctrine, but Henry, in his temporal role, can revise practice, right? So he's asserting authority. And this implementation of reform begins to happen. Now, Henry has many different factions within his court and those around him. He has many bishops who are Catholic traditionalists who just want to keep everything the same, how it is. There are Catholic humanist reformers like Thomas More, and kind of in that Erasmus vein. And then there are evangelicals like Thomas Cromwell. But Henry has his own take on things. And so we begin to see that this, we won't call it a middle way or a compromise yet, but you begin to see really kind of early on. So we started out as sort of traditionalist, right? And now we're sort of swinging this way, right? We're gonna go more towards evangelical, but even within that, there's some nuance. So one thing that's super important to Henry is this adherence to royal supremacy. The Pope is encroaching on the king's authority, and he doesn't like that, and wants to really hang on to that notion. But he does not endorse the notion of justification by faith alone, but rather this dynamic of sanctification between the healing of the human will, time that allows one to like fully receive the salvific grace. Henry has a high view of the sacraments. He maintains that the Eucharist is efficacious, that it is not just a memorial, that it does something, including prayers for the dead. And the Eucharist initially, even in the midst of these changes, stays in Latin and mostly stays the same. But he does lift up the primary authority of the Bible as a norm for all Christians and the necessary health of the church. So taking a page from Erasmus, where it's what's really going to save the church is not structural reform, but the formation of good character among individual Christians, right? And the Bible is necessary for that. And so he lifts up the Bible. He endorses the Coverdale Bible, right? So now we've gone from Tyndale's, who was not allowed to be published in England. Now we have the Coverdale Bible, which is, and on the cover of that, and if I had made a slideshow, you would see it, it's worth looking up. There is, he's on the cover of the Coverdale Bible. He sees himself as a King Hezekiah who is reshaping the proper worship of God by drawing people away from idolatry, and he's following this model of anointed biblical kings. So we already see this blending of the traditional and the evangelical happening. But then Anne Boleyn is executed the Tower of Green in 1536. So I don't know, a lot happens, right? In 3 short years from Elizabeth being born to Anne Boleyn being executed. And just 2 months later, the 10 articles are produced. These are sort of, you'll have the 10 articles and then the 6 articles, and the 10 articles lean evangelical, and the 6 articles are going to lean more traditional Catholicism. So the 10 articles affirms 3 sacraments: baptism, Eucharist, and confession. Justification by the merits of Christ's passion, right? However, works are required as a sign of one's faith. And it does actually defend the use of images and ceremonies and prayers to the saints, but it also critiques devotional excesses. the praise or veneration of images. So it seems to be, it's okay, just don't go overboard. It's kind of where it ends up. And this also this thought that, anyway, relics, not so much. People, sort of taking home pieces of the Eucharist and keeping it in their home, as an object of devotion. Also, that's a no-no. But you can still have saints, and you can still have stained glass windows, and you can still light candles. And it's okay to have traditional liturgy, all this is fine. And then just chronologically, just a little bit later, a year later, Prince Edward is born to Jane Seymour at Hampton Court Palace. So now Henry has a male heir, Prince Edward. After the 10 articles, these royal injunctions come out and were really pushed out by Thomas Cromwell, who has become King Henry's sort of primary advisor and his exchequer for the realm. And it's hard, I mean, I don't know, Cromwell and Cranmer, it's so like, they're two different people. And one is an archbishop and will work on the prayer book, and the other one is this theologian, administrative mastermind who will have a huge influence on what happens from kind of a different chair in the whole way things are happening. But the royal injunctions push forward again this idea of royal supremacy. They reduce the number of saints' days. So there are a lot of saints, and people get the day off when it's a saint's day, or they have some time off to go to church when it is a saint's day. And there are so many that nobody's getting any work done. And so Cromwell's like, we're not gonna have all that. We're gonna have this, we're not gonna, we can have saints, but we're not gonna have this many saints days. And then the other thing is the encouragement to give to the poor rather than to the upkeep of shrines. So, so this shift in how they're approaching the common folk to say, if you're gonna give your money, don't give it to upkeep the shrine for this relic or whatever it is, give your money to help those to the poor. The other thing that happens, in this time is the suppression of monasteries. So the monasteries are these large, communities of industry and learning. And they have a tremendous amount of wealth, and they produce wealth. They are also, the monastic system is under the authority of orders which are international. So fall directly under Rome, right? As opposed to the Church of England, right? So the various orders have abbots, and those abbots are accountable to the international order of monasteries that they're a part of, and whether that's Benedictine or Cistercian or whatever it may be. So they're less controllable. But the bottom line is they really need the income and money from these monasteries to pay for course, all that stuff. But the monasteries are also beloved, and there are a lot of monks, and there is a movement. This is like maybe the first time that the population, the general folk, start to sort of press back against evangelical reform, and you have the pilgrimage of grace, and where folks come out to say, not monastery, and they sort of stick up for their traditional faith. Any thoughts on corrections? Okay, right. Then there's a second set of royal injunctions. These come from Cromwell. This is sort of the high point of evangelical reform thus far, and he may take it a little bit too far. So no candles in front of saints. So, candles are part of worship, and so don't light candles in front of the saints, no veneration of images, or relics, and no more pilgrimages.
Right.
So this is not going over well, folks. And so in 1538, Henry intervenes and the pendulum swings back this way. So now we're going this way, and he names the necessity of the real presence. He sticks up for that. No moralism. He says clerical marriage is a big no, no. That should not be allowed, just like it used to be. And Bibles that are written in English, not without a royal license. So he doesn't want English Bibles just floating around out there. You gotta like prove that you can handle it.
Was there one particular version that got seems?
Oh, it's the Coverdale. It's the Coverdale version that gets licensed. But, sorry.
I said with his picture.
There's a picture on it. So like, you're not gonna have, like, one of the earlier injunctions was that every church would have a Bible by, I don't know, it was 1541 or something like that, right? And then that never really happens because Henry kind of intervenes here and makes it harder for you to get Bibles. Now Edwards, right, we're gonna get the, as we go a little further along, eventually we'll get the King James version of the Bible, which would be a big deal, right? But that doesn't happen for a little while. So then the sixth articles come out in 1539. They affirm the real presence in the Eucharist. It reverts to communion in one kind, so we were having, we used to have one kind, you just got the bread, then communion in two kinds was served, and that became part of the Eucharistic practice, and now going back to just the bread, yeah.
So it had been in both kinds of early church. When did that stop as a tradition?
When did people stop having both?
Yeah, like, I mean, it said you went back to communion,
Right.
and so obviously there was one of the reformational things was both kinds. But in Rome, it hadn't been for,
Right.
when did that stop? Was there a reason for that?
I'm not totally sure, I haven't had, but I take a guess, and I would think that it probably, when, it wouldn't have happened in the first 3 centuries, for sure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we can post Constantine, and where the Eucharistic meal is getting, as Christianity becomes the religion of the state, and you've got bigger and bigger gatherings of people, it becomes more and more a symbolic meal, right? There's just a little bit of bread and a little sip of wine, it's not a whole thing. And my guess is that somewhere in there is when that would probably have happened, yeah.
I was gonna add a couple of things if I may, in terms of the two kinds. The elevation of the clergy over the laity is kind of symbolized with that only they get the full meal, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth stressing that this is not just a religious revolution, this is a political revolution. And there are two things in particular that you ought to understand what's going on. Is note that Henry does not by himself install Reformation. He goes to Parliament and he has Parliament. It's the first time a king goes to England and says, look, I want to do something that's so big I can't do it by myself. I can only do it with you guys. And that really changes the nature of the English Constitution. If Parliament can say, hey, we are equal with you, we have as much support as you do, that's gonna pay off in spades for the next century. And then the other thing is, the church at the time of this held about a third of the wealth in England. So within a matter of years, a whole bunch of people come in and they buy all this land or these monasteries at fire sale prices, like, and then they're gonna be Protestant.
Right.
Because the one thing they fear more than anything else, they're gonna say, hey, you know what, that bad man back. They are building, suddenly there are a lot of people who own a lot of land and say, man, we do not wanna go back to the old days.
Right.
This is where Why do you go for it?
Just as a footnote to that, my understanding is that you go see some of the lovely old homes in England these days. Basically, at least the core of it is a former monastery.
Yeah.
That was given at the time, so I'm not saying that they didn't use some of the money for the crown, the 5 wars, but a whole lot of it went to influential people.
Oh, yeah,
And they wanted to keep their property.
that's right.
People in Ireland are still salty about that. That was the church of both.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
they separated.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. One, the overtaking, if you will, of the monasteries or dissolving of them. Didn't that involve, I mean, it was a lot more than political, didn't that involve violence and killing people?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Because-
skipped a lot of.
that, yeah, I was just trying to get a picture in my mind. And regarding the theology, was it around this time that to the Lord's Prayer that was added for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory?
That's a great question.
Because the Roman Church doesn't have that, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, and it crossed my mind, I've always been curious when that last sentence was added.
It kind of comes after
I
that.
think it comes a little bit.
It's not,
later, but
it's not spoken as part of the Lord's Prayer, but it is, it's said at the end, if you look in the Catholic version.
Oh,
So you know,
yeah,
so you know, Catholics kind of stop saying it in unison at that one point,
Right.
but then it gets said, maybe by the priest, kind of after.
later.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but it is an interesting question.
Yeah, just when
How did that
I
get tackled?
visit, when I got to visit churches, you know, and I'm speaking with congregations, like, oh,
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to do a little research, yes.
I just wanted to add one fun fact that from the Coverdale translation. In the Book of Common Prayer, Psalms that we read are all the Coverdale translation for every Sunday. So we're reading from the Coverdale translation on Sundays, or anytime we use the Psalms in the book, that's the same.
Slightly different, if you look up like NSRD, Psalms versus what's in the prayer, they'll be a little bit different. The original, they were very beautifully done. So we hang on to those. I think they're slightly ended for the 1779 third, just, I can't remember what, just I think for language, there's a special word for it, but just sort of a use of language update, right, where certain phrases and words really aren't used anymore.
I'm just curious to see, does the 79 version use, try to avoid gender?
No,
So,
it's
that's
still,
like-
there's still plenty gendered,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Well, I mean, so one of the things about the 79 prayer book is that there's been a critique that it was like 10 years too early. Like that like, so there could have been revisions to the prayer book, but we weren't ready for like having, working on gender issues, any of that kind of stuff, right? So we just didn't do that in that prayer book yet.
Yeah, Dr. King, who will be visiting us sometime soon, he had said in one of his classes that they were literally changing the prayer book on the floor upon its being created. So it was put together really quickly, actually. So the last few moments, some of it was changed and added and edited right on the council floor.
Or
Yeah.
Okay, so Henry intervenes, necessity of real presence, no clerical marriage, no English Bibles without a royal license. We affirm the real presence, we revert to communion in one kind. We revalue the vows of chastity and monasticism. He affirms the value of masses for the dead. Affirms clerical celibacy, affirms the right of confession and the practice of penance, and so reasserts kind of a sacramental penitential system, which had been kind of downsized, but he kind of lifts it back up again. But he does not really address that fundamental issue of salvation, which we started out talking about. Is it this cooperative thing, or justification by faith alone, or are they all really just saying the same thing, but getting lost in the words that they use? And so you have traditional, evangelical, traditional, right? The evangelical fortunes are reversed. Evangelical bishops have to resign. Cranmer lays low and just tries to stay out of trouble. And Cromwell is ultimately executed. The surviving elements of this time period are the Great Withdrawal and the distinction of monasteries. Those stay in place. In 1546, Henry is dying, and he names a regency council for Edward his son, but he packs it with evangelical reformers. So this is really interesting. So you've got this traditional swing back, and yet when it comes to his son being the King of England, he surrounds him with evangelical members because the royal supremacy is so important for him. And if the pendulum swings back too far toward traditionalism, that there's a chance that that would be diminished again. As the temporal authority of the church, that would be diminished, and also the whole property issue that you just brought up, right? If we sort of recommune with Rome, then a lot of the good things that Henry believes, the good things that will happen could get undone, and he doesn't want to see that happen, and he doesn't want his son's authority in any way diminished. So he surrounds him with evangelical leaders, of course, because he's just a little boy, and of course then they start, and then this pendulum swings the other way again, right? So afterwards, then you'll have the first book of Common Prayer. You will have a book of homilies by Cranmer. Cranmer kind of comes back into the situation, and then in 1549, the book of Common Prayer. Right, so that's 49 years from, from Erasmus, or it's 50 years from Erasmus's first visit. So this happened really fast. A lot happened really, really fast. And it went like that. And it's gonna keep going like that for quite a while. All right, that's all I have for today. So yeah, just enjoy one another's company, and I don't have a discussion question for you, just what did you find interesting today? Okay.
It's always, yeah. Well, in the church,